Welcome to another story from Grandpa Harry. Before we dive in, let me say this. Life has a funny way of teaching you lessons when you least expect it. Sometimes the people you trust most will shock you, and the secrets hiding in plain sight can change everything. If you stick around, I promise you'll see how patience, observation, and a little quiet cunning can save more than just your pride. Now, let me tell you about a time my own son nearly broke everything we built. I spent 40 years building a small family business. Every nail in the floorboards, every creak of the office door, every dusty ledger on the shelf carried sweat, late nights, and more than a little stubborn pride. My son, Tommy, grew up in that world, shadowing me with wide-eyed admiration. On the surface, he seemed like the perfect heir, responsible, eager to learn, always nodding along in meetings. But there's a truth I've learned the hard way. Admiration can mask ambition, and eagerness can disguise impatience. The smell of aged leather and the faint hum of the old cash register will always bring me back to those days, and sometimes it still makes my stomach twist. It started with small things. A client would call about a missing order, or a shipment would arrive damaged when it had been handled meticulously the week before. I chalked it up to growing pains, the natural chaos of business. But there was a niggling feeling I couldn't shake. One evening, I stayed late in the office, listening to the metallic click of the safe and the rustle of old papers. That's when I noticed something unusual. A few receipts in Tommy's handwriting didn't match the rest of our records. My first thought was simple oversight. He was learning, after all. But something about the way the ink caught the light on the dusty paper made me pause. I remember the sharp taste of my coffee that night, bitter and cold from hours of neglect. I pulled the ledgers from the shelves, leafing through the yellowed pages. Every entry seemed in order, but then, tucked behind a stack of invoices, I spotted a small, forgotten ledger. It was dusty, neglected, and almost laughed at me with its secrecy. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the edge of my desk, feeling its weight, feeling that strange mix of dread and curiosity. It was the kind of moment that hits you quietly, a warning bell you can't ignore. And deep down, I knew that whatever was in that ledger would tell me a truth I wasn't ready to face, about my son, about trust, and about how easily things you build with love can unravel when pride takes the wheel. The next few weeks were tense. Every interaction with Tommy felt like walking on a floorboard that might collapse beneath me. He smiled, offered to take over meetings, even joked about handling the accounts better than old Dad ever could. And I wanted to believe him. I really did. But then, small things started stacking up like storm clouds on a quiet morning. An invoice would be missing. A supplier would call, confused about a shipment they had never received. The hum of the office, once comforting, now felt like a drum of warning. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as he moved around, and every creak of the office door sounded louder than it should. One evening I found myself alone again. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings and old coffee, and the dim light of the desk lamp made the office feel smaller, tighter. I pulled that forgotten ledger from the stack and opened it. My heart sank with every page. Tommy had been selling pieces of the business quietly, thinking no one would notice. Not out of desperation, not because he needed the money. This was pure ego, pure impatience to make his mark without understanding what he was dismantling. There were numbers, contracts, signatures that he had forged, and the ink still smelled fresh, like betrayal mixed with the faint tang of coffee from his morning cup. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't. I sat in the chair, running my fingers over the edges of the pages, tasting the bitter reality of what my son had done. Every instinct told me to explode, to yell, to shatter the calm we'd always maintained. But I've learned that anger is a poor teacher, and patience can reveal more than punishment ever will. I decided to observe, to gather more evidence quietly, and that's when I noticed it. A small, almost invisible footnote at the very back of the ledger. A detail that could save us or ruin us completely, depending on how it was handled. In that moment, I realized that the real story wasn't just about what Tommy had done. It was about whether I could save the business and, in some strange way, my son too, before it was too late. The following days were some of the longest I've ever endured. I watched Tommy more closely than I'd ever watched anyone, even myself. Every handshake, every nod, Every proud smile he flashed to clients felt loaded with secrets. I could smell the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the office, a mixture of lemon and ambition, and it made my stomach twist in ways I hadn't felt in years. There were nights I would sit in the darkness of the office, the faint click of the old heater keeping me company, leafing through the ledger over and over, tracing lines, connecting numbers, trying to make sense of the betrayal that was, by all accounts, my own son's doing. And then it hit me. The first micro-reveal. One of the sales contracts, the one he had sold to a buyer without consulting me, contained a clause he hadn't noticed. A clause that effectively meant the buyer assumed a massive liability if they failed to meet certain delivery schedules. I could almost hear Tommy's voice in my head, smug, thinking he had made a move that would elevate him. But what he hadn't realized was that this little footnote would turn the tables completely. I ran my fingers over the worn leather of the ledger, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. This was more than paper. It was the fulcrum on which everything could pivot. Our business, our relationship, maybe even his future. I decided to act carefully. Confrontation without preparation would have been a disaster. I made subtle inquiries, called a few contacts who had been involved in the recent deals, and quietly confirmed that Tommy's smart moves were built on sand. The sound of the phone line connecting, the faint hum in my ear, every dial tone, they all added to the tension. Each conversation chipped away at the illusion that my son was innocent, that this was a learning curve. No, this was ego, pure untempered ego, and if left unchecked, it would have destroyed everything we had built together. Finally, the night came when I decided I could wait no longer. I told Tommy I wanted to review some documents together, and we sat in the office late, the smell of paper and old ink mixing with the faint aroma of his cologne. He leaned back in the chair, confident, like a man who had nothing to fear. That confidence, that smugness, was exactly what I needed. I slid the ledger across the desk toward him. The rustle of the pages seemed louder than it should, and I could see the moment his eyes caught the names, the numbers, the footnotes. It was subtle at first, a tightening of the jaw, a blink, a micro-expression that betrayed panic he couldn't hide. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above made the silence almost unbearable. "Tommy," I said, voice calm, deceptively calm. "Do you know what this is?" I let the question hang in the air. He fumbled, words catching in his throat. "It's, just some old accounts," he said, hoping I'd accept the lie. But I could see through it. The ledger didn't lie. The contracts, the signatures, the hidden clauses, all proof that he had acted without consent. His ego had driven him to gamble with our legacy, and now quietly, the universe was about to deal him a blow he hadn't anticipated. I could hear my own heart pounding in the office, the paper trembling slightly under my fingers as I kept the ledger in place. The real twist, the ledger's footnote, became clear. The clause meant that if the buyer failed to deliver on their obligations, they would be liable for triple the losses. Tommy had thought he was clever, that he could sell off parts of the business for quick gains. He had not only endangered us financially, but had also unknowingly created a mechanism that would expose him legally and financially if the deal went south. I felt a strange combination of relief and sorrow. Relief that I could protect the business. Sorrow that my son had thought he knew better than the years I had spent building it. I leaned back and let him sweat a little. The office was silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. I could see the conflict in his eyes, guilt, fear, a hint of regret, and I realized something important. This was more than about money. This was about trust, respect, and understanding the weight of decisions that ripple through a family. He had to feel the consequences, and he had to learn. The hum of the heater seemed louder now, almost like a drumbeat counting down the final moments before the reckoning. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "I didn't think," he began, and I stopped him with a gentle but firm tone. "You didn't think, Tommy. That's the problem." There was no anger in my voice, only the weight of experience, the kind of quiet authority that comes from watching life teach hard lessons. I explained the clause, the potential fallout, and how his ambition, if unchecked, could have destroyed everything. The realization hit him fully then, and for the first time, I saw him humbled. It wasn't shame I wanted him to feel, not exactly, but an understanding of the responsibility he carried. By the time the night ended, the ledger had done its work. It had revealed the truth, exposed the risks, and created a space for accountability. Tommy sat there, quiet, absorbing everything, and I knew the lesson had landed. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a crucial one. A reminder that even when betrayal feels personal and deep, there is a way to correct it if you approach it with patience, observation, and strategic action. I leaned back in my chair, letting the smell of old leather and ink fill my senses, feeling both exhausted and oddly triumphant. The first real cracks in trust had been confronted. The hidden ledger had revealed more than I expected, and I knew the next steps would define whether this family could recover or fracture further. And in that quiet office, with the night pressing against the windows and the faint buzz of the streetlights outside, I realized something else. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones you achieve without raising your voice, without slamming doors, and without burning bridges. Quietly, patiently, with the wisdom that only comes from years of mistakes and survival. The morning after our late-night session, the office felt heavier. The air smelled faintly of old paper, dust, and the remnants of Tommy's cologne. Even the sunlight filtering through the blinds seemed muted, as if it knew the gravity of what had transpired. Tommy arrived early, unusually quiet, the confident swagger replaced by a tension that made him almost stiff. He avoided my gaze, fiddling with the pen on the desk, the metal tip clicking rhythmically, nervously. I could hear it clearly, each click echoing in the empty room like a warning drum. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but I knew this had to play out. He needed to confront the weight of his choices. I pulled the ledger toward me again, spreading it open between us like a bridge and a barrier all at once. The numbers, contracts, and footnotes stared back at him, relentless in their impartiality. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and finally whispered, "I thought I was helping. I thought I could make things better." There it was, the admission, raw and trembling, coated with both fear and regret. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch, letting him absorb the reality. There is a lesson in quiet patience, one I've learned over decades. Sometimes people need the weight of truth to settle before words can even matter. I decided to guide him carefully, to let him see the moral complexity of his actions. "Tommy," I said gently, "what you did wasn't out of malice, but it was reckless. You gambled with the family's future and your own reputation. And worse, you underestimated the consequences of your ambition. That's something you have to carry with you whether you like it or not." His hands tightened around the pen, veins standing out, the sound of his nervous tapping filling the room again. The ledger wasn't just a record of transactions. It was a mirror, reflecting not only what he had done but who he had allowed himself to become in those brief, impulsive moments. The real twist, the one even he hadn't anticipated, became clearer as we walked through the ledger line by line. That hidden clause, the footnote I'd discovered earlier, meant that the buyer could be held responsible for triple the losses if they failed to meet their obligations. Tommy's brilliant move to sell a portion of the business had unintentionally created a trap that protected us. It was ironic, almost poetic, that his arrogance had provided a safeguard he hadn't considered. The sound of the ledger pages turning, the scratch of the pen marking notes, the faint hum of the heater, all of it felt amplified in the quiet of the office. Each moment carried the tension of a family's legacy teetering on a knife's edge. We sat there for hours, dissecting the contracts, discussing the implications, and examining what this meant for both the business and our relationship. Tommy's ego, bruised but alive, began to soften as he realized that the consequences of his actions were not abstract numbers on a page but tangible risks that could have ended everything. The smell of coffee from my cup mingled with the scent of old ink, grounding us both in the reality that this wasn't a game. It was life, complicated, unforgiving, and unyielding. I could feel the subtle shift in him, the beginning of humility. and the dawning understanding that ambition without foresight is dangerous. By the afternoon, we had reached a tentative understanding. He would reverse the unauthorized deals where possible and begin a process of repair with the buyers, guided by the ledger's detailed records. I could see the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, a mixture of relief, shame, and the slow build of wisdom. It wasn't a happy resolution. That would be too simple for what had transpired. But it was a meaningful one. It reminded me of something I often tell people. Victory is not always about punishment or triumph. Sometimes it's about surviving the storm with your principles intact, with relationships intact, even if trust is shaken. There was also a quieter, subtler lesson that lingered in the office air, almost imperceptible, like the faint smell of old paper that never quite leaves the room. The ledger, forgotten and dusty, had exposed far more than financial missteps. It had exposed the human flaws beneath the surface, ambition, impatience, pride, and it forced both of us to confront them. I realized then that the true victory wasn't in saving the business. It was in showing Tommy that choices have consequences, and that understanding those consequences requires patience, reflection, and sometimes the humility to admit when you're wrong. As the day drew to a close, I noticed a subtle change in him. He moved with less swagger, spoke with less certainty, and listened more carefully. It wasn't complete redemption. I don't believe anyone is ever fully redeemed in moments like these. But it was a start, a micro-victory. And as I leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar creak of the leather and the smooth weight of the ledger beneath my fingers, I couldn't help but think how strange it is that sometimes the smallest, most overlooked details, a footnote in a dusty ledger, can carry the power to reshape a family, a business, and a life. We left the office that evening with the air slightly lighter, the sun setting through the blinds casting long shadows across the room. I could still feel the tension lingering, but I also felt something else, a quiet sense that, for the first time in weeks, we had begun to understand each other, however imperfectly. There would be more challenges, more lessons, and perhaps more betrayals in life. But that day, with the ledger open between us, we had taken the first steps toward reconciliation, accountability, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust. And in that moment, I knew the next chapter was already waiting. One that would test not only the strength of the business, but the bonds of family itself. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. Tommy worked diligently to reverse the deals, apologizing to clients, and repairing relationships that had been strained by his impulsive decisions. The ledger, once forgotten and dusty, became our guide. Every footnote, every line a map through the chaos he had created. I watched him with a mix of relief and quiet sorrow. Relief that we could save the business. Sorrow that it had taken a near disaster for him to understand the gravity of his actions. I could smell the faint aroma of ink and old paper lingering in the office, and it reminded me how even the smallest things, a hidden ledger, a forgotten clause, can carry the weight of consequences. One afternoon, we sat together at the office table, reviewing the final steps to restore our operations. Tommy looked at me, eyes tired but sober, and said, "I didn't realize how much responsibility really meant, Dad." His voice was soft, almost fragile, stripped of the bravado he had carried for so long. I nodded, feeling both pride and sadness. Responsibility, I realized, isn't something you can teach with lectures or warnings. It's something you must experience, often through mistakes, pain, and quiet reflection. The hum of the heater, the faint rustle of the papers, and the distant street noises outside made the room feel alive with lessons learned. I decided it was time to share a piece of advice I'd carried for decades. "Tommy," I said, "trust is fragile, and ambition without patience is dangerous. But mistakes, if faced honestly, can teach more than years of success ever will. You've learned that now. Painfully, yes, but you've learned it." He nodded, taking in every word. The office smelled faintly of coffee and pencil shavings, and for a moment, it felt like the world had slowed, giving us space to breathe, reflect, and rebuild. There was also a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in our relationship. The ledger had exposed his mistakes, but it had also exposed my own vulnerabilities, my willingness to let him grow. my hope that he could learn from observation rather than punishment. I realized that fatherhood isn't about control. It's about guidance, patience, and knowing when to step in and when to let experience be the teacher. The faint click of the heater, the smell of aged paper, even the soft creak of the office chair, they all became reminders that life's lessons are often hidden in the ordinary moments we overlook. By the end of that week, the business was stable, the clients reassured, and Tommy humbled. He had apologized sincerely, not just in words, but in actions, and I could see the beginnings of a man learning the weight of responsibility. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Trust, once shaken, never fully returns in the same shape. But it was meaningful. Sometimes victory isn't about punishment or triumph. It's about surviving the storm, learning from the chaos, and emerging with understanding, even if relationships remain subtly altered. As we closed the office that evening, I put the ledger back in its drawer, dusting it off with a sense of reverence. That little book had taught more than I ever imagined, about accountability, humility, and the intricate balance between ambition and responsibility. I could smell the faint tang of ink and aged paper as I slid the drawer closed, a sensory reminder that lessons often arrive in unexpected packages. Tommy stood beside me, quiet, reflective, and for the first time in weeks, there was no tension, no fear, only a shared understanding that life will test you in ways you can't predict. Before we left, I said something I hope he'll remember for the rest of his life. Son, mistakes are part of living, but how you respond to them defines who you are. Remember this ledger, not just for what it revealed about business, but for what it revealed about honesty, trust, and patience. Carry that with you, and you'll be stronger for it. He nodded again, this time with genuine comprehension. The office smelled faintly of old leather, paper, and coffee. Ordinary scents for an extraordinary lesson. We left together, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Each step heavy with the knowledge that family, like business, requires care, observation, and sometimes quiet correction. So, my friends, if there's one thing I've learned through decades of mistakes and small victories, it's this. Pay attention to the little details, respect the weight of trust, and never underestimate the lessons hidden in ordinary objects. That forgotten ledger saved not just a business, but the chance to guide a son through the storm of his own ambition. Life isn't always fair, but it does offer opportunities to correct course if we're patient, observant, and willing to act. Keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and your heart steady. Sometimes the quietest moments hold the loudest lessons. And if you want more stories like this, with mistakes, betrayals, and the wisdom that comes after, stick around. There's always another lesson waiting just around the corner.